Thank you for listening to Torah Media Atlanta. Won't you consider making a donation to help support this important work? Just go to TorahMediaAtlanta.com and click on the donate link. Thank you very much.
Okay. As we make progress, we turn our attention to verse 3. All right, round of applause. The truth is, even before I begin, two quick announcements. Number one is, as you know, next week we will not be meeting. And if you didn't know that, you heard it here. And additionally, my wife and I would like to invite all of you and your spouses to a Malafa Malka in our home on December 18th, which is the Motzei Shabbos Saturday night, not immediately following Hanukkah, but the one after that. December 18th. It would be helpful to get an RSVP, although I do know that it is difficult just for planning purposes. So if I could trouble you to let me know either after class or next week, well, not next week, maybe in 2 weeks, or send me an email. Whichever way you would like to inform me, that would be great. December 18th, please mark your calendars. We would love for all of you to be able to join us. Okay. Did anybody prepare these verses last week when we split up into chavrusas?
What do you mean by prepare?
Prepare meaning, did anybody notice these verses? Did anybody start questioning these verses? Or did you spend most of your time reviewing the list of questions, page 2? Good. There's nothing wrong with that. Just wanted to know. So that means we're approaching this fresh. Good. So let's jump in. Vayomer Elokim, Pasuk Gimel, verse 3. Vayomer Elokim, Yehi Or, Vayehi Or. Let there be light, and there was light. Any questions? Great. Let's go on.
We have to spend at least a day or two. What is that? What is it?
A day?
5 words.
I have about 2 months worth. Okay, so let's start putting this verse through the shredder, and let's take it apart, and let's see basic questions that a person that has never seen this verse before would ask. Okay, why Elokim? What's the question?
Why was the use of this name of God?
Why this particular name of God? The truth is that this name of God was used in verse 1. So it's not so strange to use this name of God in verse 3. It may have been a long while since we've seen verse 1. But verse 1 is essentially one verse away. So to use the name Elokim here shouldn't really come as a surprise. The real question would be, why use that name of God in the first verse? Which is a valid question, and we may not discuss it now, but we'll get there when we get to chapter 2. Yes? Question?
I have a radical question.
Yeah.
Okay, it starts with Bob. So that's going to mean that it's going to be, it's going to have a future tense. But then again, there's another bite. Biting in the first part, and biting in the second part. One was future and then one was present.
So again, Yehi Or is let there be light in the future. Vayehi Or is and there was light. One of them is in the future, one of them is in the past. Okay? Good? Yes?
But this poem is written the same way.
Written the same way? I don't see it written the same way. One is Yehi and one is Vayehi. Right. That Vav changes the tense. That's correct.
To pass.
To past.
But when you put above in front of Vayomer, or like the
And he said.
it makes the future.
Well, yes and no. We're not going to get into the details, but generally speaking, there is something called a vav hamahapech, the vav that changes the tense from future into past. So you have Yehi is future, let there be light, Vayihi, and there was light. We won't complicate matters any further. Yes?
Was it light as we know it, or is it like spiritual light?
Excellent. Okay, that's an obvious question, but it needs to be articulated. So thank you for articulating it. What is this light? Okay, again, we've discussed preconceived notions need to be left at the door. So clearly, if we're going to make assumptions here, we're going to get ourselves into trouble. What was this light? Good. Any other questions? Said. Excellent. What's the question? Who is he talking to? Excellent. Great question. That's another question. Hold on. First of all, who is he talking to exactly? What was that?
It's the first time we saw that he said something.
That's correct. It was the first appearance of saying something. Who was he talking to? And the addendum to that question, or maybe perhaps even a separate question, is
Why would God have to speak to make something be?
what is this concept of speech when we're talking about God? Whoa. Hold on. What? Is this something I said? Okay, slow down. Yes. Yes.
Speak.
Not everybody at once now. Not everybody at once.
How that he was speaking?
How do we know?
I mean, it was a happening. It was the whole thing was a happening, but how do we know he said, let there be light?
Okay, so let's take a look at this verse. Everybody turn to verse 3, and let's read the words. Vayomer Elokim, and God said, Yehi or let there be light. How do we know that God said, let there be light? Because it says it in the verse. So now we have it in the Torah. Now that we have it in the Torah, why do we have it in the Torah? Clearly there's something for us to learn from this.
Organizing the chaos.
Organizing the chaos. So we're getting into explanations now. I'm still in the realm of questions. Are there any other questions in this verse?
I want to talk about the set.
Okay. Go ahead, Donald. Give it to her.
First of all, why is the and in there anyway? What do you need and in there? It just could be God said, let there be light. And God said, let there be light. I don't understand why there's an and in there.
Okay. Good question.
I think what separates man from all other creatures is the ability to talk, to say things.
Okay, we haven't seen man yet, so I don't know how we can understand that from here. Although it's a good point. We can talk about that when man arrives on the scene in a good couple of years, yeah. But until then, we're talking about God speaking. Yes?
This is a bigger question. Why is there a Torah to begin with? And if God has given us the Torah, then perhaps he's recounting to us for our benefit how all this came to pass.
That's a great question. In fact, somebody asked me that question after the first class, and I think it's a worthy point to mention that there are certain things that are included in the Torah and certain things that are not included in the Torah. If you view the Torah as a history book, you will find that it is sorely lacking in accuracy. If you view the Torah as a science manual, you will find that much of it doesn't describe science. If you deal with it as a sociological, you're going to find that every realm of endeavor is going to be missing pieces. The Torah is nothing other than a book of guidance and instruction. Once you understand that, and the truth is, how do I know that? Because the word Torah means guidance, instructions. The Hebrew word for parents, horim. The Hebrew word for teachers, morim. Horeh, moreh, Torah. It's all the same root. instructing, leading, guiding, inspiring. It's all the same. So this is a book that's supposed to guide us, which means that every element in this book is there for a reason. And that reason is to teach us how to live our lives. So there may be many people that take the creation account and try to fit it in to contemporary scientific terms and try to understand it based on the current laws and theories, etc., etc. But if you think that the Torah is only presenting the account of creation in order to teach us science, that is a reductionist attitude. That is cutting it away from its divine source and turning it into a secular work, which is a science book. A science book is just dealing with what is it? Nothing beyond that. So when it comes to Torah, we always have to understand that anything that's written there has to have a lesson for us in life. There may be additional insights and additional pieces of information, but that's not all it is. There's clearly something beyond that. Which means that evidently, if God presented us these verses in His Torah, then it's not to scramble our brains in trying to figure out what kind of light it is, what kind of light it is, and when was time created. Because ultimately at the end of the day, so what is a question that we can ask ourselves. And if we don't have an answer to that, that's a problem. Because then we look at that verse and say, there was no reason to write that verse other than to describe what happened. And that's it. I don't know why. Okay.
It's like words are very important because the whole thing came to be because God said so.
Good. Excellent. So we'll get to the answer soon. But right now we're still in the rental question. Any other questions on this verse? Yes?
My question is, why does it say and there was light? If God said, let there be light, He's God.
Good.
She is God.
Good.
Is God.
So what do you think is going to happen? And it was popcorn? Right.
Is this the first time where we got the cause and effect? No, it's the second time.
It would seem that this is the first point in the Torah describing a cause and effect reaction. Yes. Any other questions?
I'm perplexed by something. It says labor and year, so it's like it's saying, let there be light. The next sentence it says, and God separated light and darkness. But I thought earlier in the game we had all the stuff of creation already created. I don't get why this doesn't say God separated the light from the darkness. How did He then create light and then separate it? I mean, it sounds like everything was the tools of creation were already made.
Again, repeat your question.
Good luck to me.
That's what I figured. I just didn't want to say it that way.
So,
go ahead.
The question is, God had created everything. Bereishis had all the stuff of creation.
Right.
Why is the next idea God separated the light from the darkness? Because He had light and darkness, all the stuff of creation. Why does He create light and then the next sentence after that say, then He separated it?
Good. Excellent question. In other words, you're saying that it seems that we're creating something anew at this point. If indeed the very first verse is describing all of creation being created in potential, so then are we creating something new now? Or are we doing something else? Good question. Yes?
Which follows with the question, why are we starting with and?
Good. So that was Donald's question. Good. Any other questions?
The audience who would read these words, or they can be read to them, are people who just left Egypt. These are fresh words out of a scroll that's being read to them. They had just left Pharaoh, who was the only person that they knew in the world that said, do this, and it got done. He was Pharaoh. And we're comparing Pharaoh, if you will, our world. God said, and it happened. That was the only way to say. Pharaoh said, and it would happen. And that was trying to say that the most important man in the world who said things, here's a comparison. Otherwise, the people would not understand the power that's conferred by this.
Well, yeah, you're assuming that the Jewish people were not exposed to the 10 plagues that God wrought on the Egyptians.
This is the first word that we're read to that.
That's correct. But again, their point of reference is not merely a paro figure. They acknowledged, to whatever degree that they could acknowledge, God's existence and God's control over nature and God's... Ultimately, this was their first revelation to the fact that God created the world when He created it, because nobody was around then. But now we know, because if God could do that, that means He is in control. So perhaps they did have a point of reference from God rather than the only authority figure that they had in Egypt, perhaps. Yes, any other questions?
In each of these successive creation, in Pasuk 2 it talks about that there was darkness covering, so now we have light. There's got to be a succession. I mean, I don't know what it is, but there's got to be a reason why these things were created in the order that they were created. Because if there's light now, why wasn't the moon and the sun created then? Not until then you were born.
Good. So you've actually asked two questions in one. You didn't really express the second question in question form, but that is a question that needs to be asked. On day 4, we have the sun, the moon, and the stars kind of being positioned in the heavens. Is that light? Or are those... The what?
The sun was to rule over the light and rule over the darkness.
Okay, perhaps.
I mean, that's all it says.
Well, we haven't gotten there yet. I don't know. I'm clueless. Beyond verse 3, I am clueless. So again, this light, that light, how do we deal with 2 days of creation? We have creation of light now, and we have creation of luminaries, which is a very fancy word, which I don't know what it means, but I know it has to do with something about light, being created or positioned on day 4. How do we deal with that? But what you're suggesting is that there's a progression. There must be a progression. And I would agree with you. And in fact, let's already start working on some of the answers to some of the questions. The question was posed, why is there a vav in the beginning of this verse? The letter vav is a connector. It connects back to Pasuk 2. The letter vav, the word vav, spelled vav, or in English, V-A-V, the word vav means a hook. Means a hook. In fact, it's interesting that it's even shaped like a hook. And in grammar, it is a hook because it connects. It is a connector. Which means that if we have a vav in the beginning of a pasuk or in the beginning of a word, then it connects back to what took place previous to it. Yes?
If it wasn't, the vav wasn't there, both would be yomer. I mean,
that's correct. Well, it wouldn't make sense because, and, first of all, the vav turns it into past tense, and he said, but also the vav serves as a connector. Now, what would it say if it wouldn't have a vav there? It could be Omar, Hu Amar Vayehi. We have that verse in Tehillim and Psalms. So the vav already links it back, and as though to indicate that this is the beginning of a progression. So if you recall, we said in verse 1, we're not talking about the order of things. We're not saying that heaven was created before earth. Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz. The heavens and the earth. Is that the order? No. It's talking about the totality of existence was created in potential form. Now, when do we begin the process of creation? So the process of creation seems to be beginning in verse 3. Because remember, what did the verse 2 describe to us? Emptiness, darkness, chaos,
a presence of God,
confusion, and then we transitioned into a presence of God, which means that we're about to begin a process of Not creation. Organization. We're beginning a process of organization at this point, which means that we have a jumble of components, and now we need to organize. So essentially, the beginning of what we call creation is really essentially organization. And the beginning of that process takes place in this verse. Now, light.
I have a question about light.
Yeah.
Is that a metaphor for consciousness?
Good question. So, it would seem that the light that's being referred to over here is clearly not the light that we know of as light. Now, this isn't my suggestion. The sages say it. Surprise, surprise. So now the question is, what is the difference between the light here and the light that we know of as light? So in order to understand that, so we can talk about spiritual and physical, and okay, if you understand that, that's great. I don't particularly understand that. What is the difference between physical light and spiritual light? So let me ask you a very simple question. How does light work? Physical light. Why is it that when the lights are off I can't see anything, and when the lights are on I can see something? So clearly my eyes require a medium to be able to bounce off of objects and then, right, it bounces off objects and it reflects into my retina and however it processes it, wonderful. That's how light's going to work. How does color work?
Combination of lights.
Combination of lights.
For a conjugation of the grand or the total part of light, it's a different spectrum.
It's a different wavelength of the spectrum of color. So white light contains how many colors? All of them. So when I look at this burgundy book, this Chumash, what color is it? I'm sorry, brown. Whatever color it is. Make it simple. This red phone. What color is it? Red. Red and black. Thank you. More accurate. Now, is it really red and black? You knew I was going to ask that, didn't you? Is it really red? The answer is, well, kind of, but not really. Because essentially what's happening is that white light is hitting this object. The particular pigment, the pigmentation, what we call color, in this object, which seems red to us, what's really happening is that all the wavelengths of color are hitting it, and everything but red is being absorbed by this object, and therefore the only thing that we are able to see is the one color that it's not. That's the wavelength that it didn't absorb. Okay, let's explain it much.
Yeah, I thought it was the opposite.
You thought it was the opposite?
Yeah, the wavelength that we see. The wavelength that is.
The wavelength that we see is the only wavelength that's being reflected off of the object, right? Which is one of the reasons why when you walk out on a hot Atlanta summer day wearing a white shirt, you're not as warm as had you been wearing a black shirt. Because black is absorbing all the colors and all the wavelengths. It's not colorless, it's actually all the colors. And the white is actually bouncing all the wavelengths back at you. So isn't it interesting that all the colors that are being bounced at you appear to us as white. What we would say is colorless. Now, what am I trying to get at, besides confusing a lot of people in this room? I thought, well, I guess it's been a number of years since you...
All the colors were there, except they were absorbed in the darkness. It was really a combination of all the different wavelengths.
So clearly the physics of light physical light, all the wavelengths of color, ostensibly it existed. I don't know about at this point, but clearly at some point that kind of light exists. But now the question is, so what are we suggesting when we understand light in this way? What we're actually suggesting is that light bounces off objects and are only able to see the external, the veneer, the surface. And that's all we see with this light. Now, let's contrast that with what perhaps is spiritual light. Because spiritual light would illuminate, really illuminate. In other words, the clarity that could be achieved with spiritual light is far different than the clarity that we think we're achieving with physical light. Physical light is deceptive. It's illusory. It creates illusions because we only see the surface of objects. Spiritual light would allow us to see the essence of objects. And boy, what a different world it would be if we were able to identify the essence of something instead of what it looks like. Those of you who have been to some of my classes at this time of year will know that I often share my experience at an exhibit called Dialogue in the Dark. Dialogue in the Dark was in Atlanta. I don't know if it's still in Atlanta, but it was in Atlanta last year or 2 years ago. And
It just left.
Anybody ever go to Dialogue in the Dark?
I told her to
Okay, so let me just describe what the exhibit is. Let me describe what it is. Let me describe what the creators of the exhibit intended it to be. I believe they fell short of their goal, but that's my opinion. Dialogue in the Dark is essentially an experience for seeing people to experience blindness, albeit temporarily. And what they do is they bring you into a room and they dim the lights and then it's pitch black. And what they do is they lead you through a number of different environments wherein you have to rely upon every other sense other than sight to be able to navigate and to be able to understand where you are and how to navigate. So you walk into the first environment, you smell the smell of dirt, and you start groping in the dark, trying to feel your way through, trying to get some idea, trying to visualize in your mind's eye what this object is based on its feel, based texture, and you start noticing how you're really using every other one of your senses to get through. Now, what's interesting is that there's a tour guide, and the tour guide is helping you navigate. Now, we walked into the first environment. There's a group of 10 of us, and this fellow introduces himself, and he explains what we should expect, and if we panic at any point in time, as is understandable, then there are certain emergency procedures that could be done, etc. So he says that please follow my voice. That's what he tells us. And he says that I'm going to help you navigate. Now, I'm thinking to myself, this fellow, too bad I can't see him, but he probably looks like one of these Marines with night vision goggles on, and he's scanning the room, and he's just noticing where everybody is, making sure that nobody gets hurt. Now, I did happen to see 5 little red dots somewhere along the ceiling, which were an infrared video camera, because one can imagine how much pickpocketing would probably take place in such an environment, and therefore they have clear evidence. In fact, they have a whole audience out there watching. No. So this fellow is telling us, and then all of a sudden he tells us, he says, Sir, you're going in the wrong direction. You have to turn around and go in the opposite direction. And I'm thinking to myself, how in the world does this guy know what's going on? Anyways, he's taking us from environment to environment to environment. And then the final stations, 4 or 5 different rooms, and the final stop is a bar with bar stools and a counter, and he asks all of us to sit down. So you think it's easy to sit down, right? want to make sure it's stable. You finally sit down, and this fellow introduces himself, but this time he gives some detail. And he explains to us that he is blind. And that he was born sighted. He grew up in Atlanta, downtown Atlanta, and at 16 years of age, he was shot in a gun battle revolving around a drug deal, and he was blinded. And his world is frozen in time as he perceived it at 16 years of age. He has a brother that he knows, it's about 20 years later, he knows has aged, but in his mind, how he knew him then is how he knows him now. And he said, does anybody have any questions for me? Boy, first of all, I think everybody's in a state of shock. Recognizing that, forget the infrared, this guy's the real deal. And he was able to literally use his other senses to perceive, position, and be able to direct. So I happened to have a question. I asked him, do you find that people that are born blind versus people that became blind relate to each other in the same way? Just thought it was an interesting question. And he said that the truth is, in a certain sense, yes, in a certain sense, no. We can empathize with the challenges, we can relate to the difficulties, but if somebody tells us that this is red, we know what that means. The people that were born blind have no idea what that means. So he said it's an altogether very different experience for somebody that at one time in their life saw. So, to me, I walked out of the exhibit, I went online, and I discovered that there were downloadable materials for teachers that were taking their class on a tour to this exhibit. And to me it was fascinating to understand what was the point of this? What were they trying to get at? So of course, you can imagine that the younger elements would have fun, running around, bumping into each other, trying to figure out, you're in a supermarket setting and you're trying to feel the vegetables and the cans of soda. But their message was that before you jump to conclusions, recognize that defining things by their superficial elements can sometimes cause you to define things inaccurately. And here's a classic case where somebody would see someone who is blind, immediately categorize them, what we would call stereotyping, into a category, make certain assumptions, true or untrue, and then just move on in life. And this particular environment allowed us to encounter this individual before we were able to find out that information that would have had us stereotype him. So we discovered that he's a real human being with real feelings and real experiences. And then we were told he was blind. And then when we walked out, well, it was obvious. Maybe not so obvious with him, but sometimes obvious for others. So I just felt that they kind of fell short. They kind of turned it into a fun experience. They could have done other things that were perhaps more educational. But to me, on the way home, I reflected upon my own experience in this exhibit. And I recognized that as soon as the lights went off, sighted people became handicapped, and the handicapped became sighted. Maybe not became sighted by the flip of the switch, but clearly were able to see a lot better than the people that rely upon physical light to be able to see. And sometimes darkness allows us to see clearer than light, because light can create illusions, because we can only see surfaces. And therefore, it's very important to understand that at this beginning stage of God's organizing the world, spiritual light is created. Why?
Do you want to substitute another word for light, like understanding?
Understanding, or perhaps the word clarity would be a better word to use. Yes.
If what you're saying is true, that light obfuscates the true essence of it, you're saying, you could also be saying that God created a veneer over everything.
Correct. We'll get there. But that is a very good point. But in the meantime, why would light be the first creation? Creation in quotes. Why would that be the first step of the development of the world at this point? The answer is because if everything is a jumble and everything is disorganized, what do we need to do at this step, at this stage? We need to clarify things. We need to clarify two things, or perhaps things on a large scale and things on a small scale. Large scale is we need to know what the point of this whole thing is, because without that, we won't have any idea how each and every subcomponent fits in to the big plan. But not only that, we have to know the essence of every object that we're looking at in order to understand how to position it. A label maker is a wonderful tool, but it's useless for somebody that doesn't know what to type onto the label. If you don't know what it is that you're looking at, you're going to have a very difficult time organizing it. So spiritual light is created first as a method by which we can begin organizing. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that the very first step, right after verse 2, which talks about confusion, and everything is just one big mess, and now we have to start sorting through things, and separating components, and positioning things, and distinguishing things one from the other, we're going to have to understand what it is we're looking at before we begin the process. So light here, at least spiritual light, and maybe next week or in 2 weeks we'll see what Rashi has to say, because Rashi indeed cites the Midrash that tells us that indeed it was spiritual light that was created first. The next verse will tell us that God took it and hid it away. So we're given a moment of clarity and then darkness. Or maybe a moment of spiritual light and then physical light. Did anybody understand what I said? Getting a lot of blank stares. I don't know if you're just...
The love makes you go back to verse 2.
That's correct.
You're talking about the breath. And the breath, so the word said is not necessarily in the way we say, but it's like this I don't want the spiritual breathing because that's like too vague, but it's not the same kind of speech that we think of when you use the word said.
So we'll get to there. I was hoping to get there tonight about this concept of speech. We'll wait for 2 weeks to understand what it means, Vayomer Elokim, but at least the Vav, to answer the Vav is linking us back to the previous verse, to tell us that we need to understand the previous verse to understand this verse, and we need to understand that this is a natural progression from the previous verse to understand that the next step is, when you just have a jumble of things, where do you start? Well, first, before you start anywhere, look through the mess and see if you can identify anything. Once you identify it and you know what its purpose is, you can take it and position it correctly. Yes, question.
So, you know, light, clarity. Clarity is more concrete. Spiritual is not concrete. Spiritual is more abstract. Clarity is more concrete.
It's abstract because it deals with abstract ideas. But if we had spiritual light to be able to see through the physical, we'll call it impediments. Right? It's actually very interesting. Physical objects create shadows. Ever think about a shadow, the concept of a shadow? Light beams work, go in straight lines, and when there's an object that gets in the way, it doesn't go around it. It stops right there and casts a shadow. What's a shadow? Shadow is darkness. It almost seems as though that the physical world and physical objects are the stuff that actually block the light.
So concrete. The shadow is so concrete.
Of course it's concrete. But again, when we're talking about the essence of things, we're not talking about the physical aspect of the object. We're talking about the spiritual aspect of the object. So I don't know if you want to call the spiritual essence of an object not concrete. I don't know what it means, concrete. Concrete means that it's not real. It's probably perhaps more real than any illusion that we can think of.
Maybe the interpretation of the plague of darkness on music.
How so?
Well, it confuses the break of spirit.
It most definitely did that.
So you're suggesting that the spiritual aspects are another dimension?
Spiritual aspects are another dimension?
This whole discussion is about another dimension.
I'm not sure what you mean by dimension.
We can talk about time. We can talk about feel. We can talk about sight, hearing.
Senses, okay? Those are all physical creations.
Right? But the spiritual dimension is spoken about in science. People pray for other people. It's not, you can't handle that unless you accept the fact that it's energy of some sort.
Which is why the realm of science doesn't deal with that, because they say that should be allocated to the philosophers and theologians.
Many people experimenting in our government and other governments.
Right. So it's interesting. I just had a conversation with somebody the other night about the reductionist philosophy. In other words, it used to be that scientists were philosophers. 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, there was no such thing as science and philosophy. People that thought about things. How do these things work? How do they not work? Trying to understand the world around them. And then at some point, there seems to have been a split between the realm of science and the realm of religion, or theology, or philosophy. And scientists almost use that as an excuse. If there's anything that's inexplicable, anything that we can't explain, because it's beyond something that we can measure quantitatively, empirically, but then we just say, well, that's not science, that's religion, we don't deal with that, that's beyond our field of endeavor. So why was it that at one point in history they were merged? Because essentially it's dealing with all of reality, spiritual and physical. Now science has kind of moved away from spiritual, only focusing on physical reality, which is unfortunate because it kind of makes it seem like this is real and that's not. Which clearly a believing Jew does not believe in. All right, any questions before we call it 2 weeks?